So the basic story that we're telling is that over the past 3 years, not just in 2024, China's growth has been overstated. Does any government really undertake the kind of extreme actions that China has taken to shore up the economy when growth is at targeted levels?
Another year, another ambitious goal for the Chinese economy, 5% growth. Well, my guest says that it doesn't add up. That is what China says about its economy and the actions that it's taking right now to shore up that economy. Logan Wright is co-author of a recent report for the Rhodium Group on Chinese growth. Logan, welcome. Beijing has suggested that it was on track to hit its 5% growth goal for 2024. The World Bank recently agreed that 4.9% was actually likely given recent export numbers. The IMF has generally been in that ballpark. Your report says 2.4 to 2.8% growth in 2024, that's what China actually saw. So what do you guys know that the others don't?
I wouldn't say it's anything that we know especially, but I think if you look at a lot of the subcomponent data within China that China actually does produce, that's still official data, not all of it suggests that you're growing anywhere close to targeted levels. The basic story here is that China's had an enormous adjustment in its investment activity since 2021, since the property sector started to correct. The property sector used to be, as much as a quarter of China's economy, 20 to 25% of GDP by most accounts. Local government infrastructure investment was around, 14 to 15% of China's GDP. Both of those sources of investment have slowed significantly. Property construction is now down 68% on an annualized basis from its peak levels in the middle of 2021. And nothing else has really offset that decline. So the basic story that we're telling is that over the past 3 years, not just in 2024, China's growth has been overstated because there really hasn't been anything else that's offset the decline in property and local government infrastructure investment. In 2024, in particular, there was a significant growth from net exports as China has posted nearly a $1 trillion trade surplus, which has risen from last year. But there was still a continued slowdown in overall investment activity. In this case, not necessarily led by the property sector, but led by local governments. Credit growth was at an all-time low in 2024. Actual growth of bank assets, excluding government bonds, so a measure of credit to the non-financial corporate sector, was only 5%. In comparison, for the previous decade, from 2007 to 2016, for example, credit growth was close to 18%. When you cut credit growth by this much, and we know that investment is powered by credit from China's financial system, activity has to slow. And that's sort of the story that we're telling. In addition, the consumption growth numbers don't really add up based on how China is presenting this. If you look at headline retail sales, we've seen consumption growth that's roughly half of what it was last year. We've seen consistent weakness in consumer prices. You've seen consistent weakness in China's nominal GDP growth. And that's exactly the kinds of pressures that, to us, suggest a far weaker economy than headline real growth rates would indicate.
Logan, you wrote that 2024 was essentially a turning point in this narrative around the Chinese economy. How are Beijing's own actions contributing to this?
Yeah, I think the basic story the basic question you have to ask when you look at the data and you look at what Beijing is doing to support the economy is, does any government really undertake the kind of extreme actions that China has taken to shore up the economy when growth is at targeted levels? Because officially in 2023, they hit their growth target. And officially in 2024, until we get the data released, on Friday, they're very close to those growth levels. Yet at the same time, you have really unprecedented actions from China to try to shore up economic growth and to try to shore up consumer confidence. You have new consumer subsidy programs, trade-in programs for autos, for home appliances. You have an unprecedented mid-year budget adjustment in 2023. You have a new local government debt swap of 10 trillion yuan to try to free up additional spending for localities. you have many of these. You have these new press conferences that have been held by several ministries starting in late September to try to announce additional efforts to shore up the economy. All of this suggests something that is not quite operating in terms of a business as usual mode. And that's really, I think, the disconnect here between some of the official data and the reality. I mean, the reality of China's slowdown is revealed in falling prices, in widening trade imbalances, meaning weaker domestic demand, in slowing nominal growth, and that's the evidence we've seen over the past several years.
Help us understand, why does China advertise this kind of high growth that it likely can't achieve when we look at recent years, but also this coming year?
I mean, I think that's the critical question. Part of this, I think, is just path dependency. The fact that the growth target, the GDP growth target, is one of the few mechanisms that the government has to sort of anchor expectations bureaucratically across the entire economy and across the entire government. So if you reduce the target too much, it sends signals to local officials that growth is less of a priority. Hence, they want to sort of project an impression of stability overall. The other factors are, I think, more explicitly political. It's this argument that China needs to project its inevitable rise in the global economy. The problem that China faces at this point is that it's very difficult to rise relative to the rest of the world when you're pursuing an investment-led and manufacturing-led growth strategy. If you're the largest source of investment in the world, and China is at around 28% of global investment, and you're continuing to remain an investment-led economy, not a consumption-led economy, the only way you can grow relative to the rest of the world is by the rest of the world disinvesting or reducing production, reducing employment. That's exactly why trade conflicts are intensifying. It's why this strategy is increasingly incompatible with trade patterns in the rest of the world.
China again says that it expects growth of 5% this year, 2025. Should we see that as far-fetched?
I think growth will be modestly better in 2025 than it was in 2024, but I think that's closer to sort of a percentage point pickup on last year. Again, this is not just a last year, this year, every year distortion. It's a broader story of how the cycle is being portrayed. 2022, China was under lockdowns, was under significant sort of COVID-related disruptions for many months of the year. Yet the official data still showed 3% growth. Even when property construction was weakening by 40% during that time, sales were faltering, people were boycotting mortgages. It's very difficult to see, what the other sources of investment were under that climate that really would have restored investment to growth. Similarly, headline consumption was weaker during that year. It's that dramatic adjustment that occurred during those years that we're only now seeing, pretty much a modest cyclical improvement from those lows. And there's no question that 2025 will probably see a narrower gap between the official projections of headline growth and economic reality. But there still will likely be a gap. I mean, we don't see the case for how China can really generate 5% growth over the medium term, especially when credit growth is structurally declining in China. An investment-led economy depends upon new credit or some other source of funding for investment, whether that's corporate profitability. Corporate profitability has been under pressure because of deflationary pressure, which is fairly evident. And credit growth is slowing to all-time lows. So the question becomes, is there really a mechanism for China to restore its previous pace of financial system growth? And the problem there is that China already has the world's largest single country financial system. Its banking system is $60 trillion in assets, or a bit over half of global GDP. It's hard to keep a system that's that large growing at 10% plus rates per year. And that's probably what's required to see, a significant acceleration in Chinese investment growth in 2025.
You've talked about this distinction between an investment economy and a consumption economy. China has made noises about being interested in rebalancing the economy more toward consumption. Do you believe Beijing in this case? Do you believe that there is an interest in increasing public, domestic consumption, I should say?
It's worth keeping in mind that China's explicit goal has been to rebalance the Chinese economy toward consumption and away from investment and exports since the year 2004. At that point, there was extensive emphasis on, rebalancing China's economy, and it led to Wen Jiabao in 2007 saying that China's economy, and I'm forgetting exactly the paraphrase, was unbalanced and unsustainable because of these patterns of growth that were taking place. The critical question is, why has this not occurred? Why has the government failed in its objective to rebalance the economy? I think the answer is that high rates of investment growth funded by the financial system have made it far more difficult to get off of that path. So at this point, the constraints on consumption growth are really household income growth. How do you sustainably boost household income over the longer term, and how do you make it more evenly distributed throughout society? That requires fiscal reform. It requires structural changes in how the system is collecting taxes and how it's actually redistributing those tax revenues to households, and how they're taxing, the consumer economy and services sector economy rather than investment-led growth. These are harder questions to answer, but they're certainly not going to change in a single, these patterns certainly aren't going to change in a single year. You can take very short-term measures to boost household incomes with subsidies, or with temporary transfer payments, such as the increase in pay to civil servants, but that's on a more limited basis. The broader question is that you need to be thinking about how government spending can be, patterns can change over time. We've written in our firm a piece last year called "No Quick Fixes" that outlines the case that, in the absence of real structural fiscal reform, China's long-term consumption growth will probably be in the range of 3 to 4% in real terms. That is consistent with the patterns that's actually at the high end of countries that have reached China's level of GDP per capita of at about $12,000 of GDP per capita. In the 2 decades following that, the average rate of consumption growth in real terms among all those countries, that the top 10 economies in the world that had reached that level, were only 2.3% and 1.8% in the following decade. China would actually be outperforming those countries. But 3 to 4% real consumption growth over the long term, it basically adds up to around 1.2 to 1.5% of GDP growth from consumption, and that sort of gives you the outer range, if investment growth is going to slow, of where GDP growth is likely to be in the future. It suggests that we're looking at something closer to a sustainable rate of 3, maybe 3.5%, rather than something closer to 5.
Does that mean that all the speculation we're hearing about possible stimulus measures, some stimulus measures we've already seen in 2024, that they're not going to ultimately amount to much unless there's much more serious structural changes down the road?
That's right. I mean, incrementally, all of these stimulus measures help to prop up domestic demand in the short term. But the structural constraints on rebalancing the economy or redirecting investment toward more productive uses are the constraints within the financial system. The financial system is heavily dependent upon, it still lends heavily to the state sector, still lends heavily to local governments. Local government borrowing is roughly 1/3 of the banking system. And therefore you have to cut off those borrowers to redirect loans, a smaller volume of new credit, to more productive uses. It's not just a matter of changing patterns of lending on a dime. And similarly with consumption, there are short-term subsidies that can be made to boost household incomes, but what's going to deliver a more sustainable boost in the share of household income relative to the size of the economy is the more critical question. And that interacts with questions of China's global competitiveness in terms of wages and other costs. And that interacts with questions of how do you actually generate that sort of rise in household incomes and a redistribution of income within the global economy without a more dramatic sort of set of restructuring fiscal relationships within China. So that is our case, that there really are structural reform problems that have been long overdue. And, in many cases, there have been attempts to sort of rebalance or initiate these reforms only to see them be reversed over time.
Is this ultimately a question of whether China will prioritize technological dominance in the global trade system or stabilizing its own economy and boosting growth?
I think that ultimately it's a question on reducing imports or reducing, vulnerability to, Western imported components of critical technologies may be a security-oriented priority for Beijing. It is not, however, a growth strategy in that sense, or it's not a macroeconomic growth strategy. So, I think the real disconnect here is it's arguable how much Beijing is prioritizing economic growth versus other security-related priorities, and that can be debated. What is clearer is that the growth strategy itself isn't producing the rates of growth that are necessary to see China escape deflationary and disinflationary pressures in producer prices, declining nominal GDP growth, and a declining share of China's economy within the rest of the world as well.
All right, that's Logan Wright with the Rhodium Group. Logan, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you.